Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions. And today we're going to talk about political ideology, and specifically we're going to look at capitalism as opposed to socialism. And it's my honor to introduce to you my guest interviewee today is Professor Joe Green, who's a faculty member of the Department of History and Political Science at Dixie State University. So welcome, Joe.
Nice to be here, Bob.
Yeah, it's going to be, I understand you're the expert on campus, so I'm really fortunate to have you here. So I'm going to ask you some questions about capitalism and socialism. But before we get started, I'd like to do a little bit of a background as far as civilization and these political ideologies so that our listeners out here can understand a little bit about how these all have developed and emerged. So can you kind of give me a standard as to what aspects you would look at if you're sitting back and analyzing the world's population, how it's evolved to the point where we're at now, and more importantly, some of the political ideologies, possibly how they have developed. In other words, I remember some of your students telling me you always start with a standard. So I guess maybe that's where I'm going to lay it off to you there.
Yeah. I think Aristotle had a nice standard for a well-lived life. He talked about human flourishing. Sometimes that's translated as happiness, but basically human beings getting along with each other and being able to enjoy their lives and not being in instead of happiness, I heard one psychologist say once, we like to avoid anguish and pain. And so that would kind of be the standard, anything that gets rid of the anguish and pain, makes us healthier, wealthier, gives us knowledge. That's usually what human beings mean by flourishing, I think.
Okay, so flourishing is a key word, right?
Yeah, that would be for me. That's going to be my standard. Yeah.
All right. If we look at two factors, life expectancy and wealth, and if we went back in time, life expectancy has increased. But is it a result of the political ideology or the culture or?
Right. If you go back 200 years, okay, you find that average life expectancy everywhere in the world was around 30 years. It is the average person would die. Half of the people who were born at a particular time would die 30 years later, and half would live longer than that. Now it's 80 years. Okay, so and that 30-year number is fairly consistent all the way back through history, okay? Sometimes a little higher, but sometimes a little lower, all right? But fairly consistent on an average right up to around 1800, okay? In certain countries, in the Netherlands and Britain, and then into Northern Europe, the United States at the same time, and then spreading to various parts of the world, that life expectancy has risen, but only in the last 200 years. And it's risen at an exponential rate in the last 200 years. So what we have is a need to explain this, okay? And the explanation that I think is the only thing that can do it is the rise of free market capital. I hate the word capitalism, but free market system, a system in which innovation is allowed, not just invention. The Chinese were great inventors, but they never became a innovative civilization. It was only in the Netherlands and England and then the United States and other countries as time has gone on that you have a society that sustains innovation, that has made food cheaper and more plentiful, that's made clothing cheaper and more plentiful, that's made housing cheaper, better, higher quality. I know we don't think it's cheaper, but we pay a relatively large percentage of our income for our housing, but what we get compared to what your ancestors had 200 years ago is just magnitudes better than what they had available to them. Plus, they don't starve, they don't freeze to death, and they don't die of heat we don't die of heat exhaustion and that kind of thing because we're able to control our climates. And so those are the main things people worried about 200 years ago. Now nobody in certain countries worries about them at all.
What about with that? What you're just talking about? What about child mortality? Mortality. I'm sorry. Right, and the child mortality rate, is that pretty much been constant, or do we see changes because of improved health?
The one of there are two primary reasons why lifespans have gone from 30 to 80 in the last 200 years, and one is kids don't die anymore, nearly the rates that they used to. One, out of every 100 kids born 200 years ago, 43 died before they were 5. Okay, 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. Okay, so if you're a woman and you had 5 kids, odds are you're going to die in one of those. And families were way bigger, as you know, in those days. Lots of women died in childbirth, and that's because we didn't have medical knowledge, we didn't have science, and the reason that we didn't have good, sustained, innovative science is because we didn't have the money. We couldn't generate the surplus funds necessary so that some people could go off and be scientists and other people could go off and be doctors and experiment and figure out what was causing disease and what malnutrition is and what nutrition is and all of the other things that allow kids to live now, so that in the whole world now, only 6 kids out of 100 will die before they're 5, rather than 43.
Wow, that's amazing. This is going to sound like a strange question. If you look back at historically the homicide rate, okay, as far as deaths were concerned, if we look back, is it that was the homicide rate as we know it, was that part of the population control? That's why we didn't see the expansion that we see today? Or
yeah, I think that the modern world, free market capitalism, democracy, science, creates a world in which people don't have to worry about where the next meal's coming from, their kids starving, and other kinds of subsistence concerns that people had. And for the last 700 years, this is even before 200 years ago, which is kind of the focus we're going to be on today, but for 700 years, the homicide rate, the rate at which violence of one person to another person or one group of people to another group of people has been falling, okay? Now, Dr. Pinker at Harvard has a really nice book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he documents statistics that show how this is going on, but it's certainly a characteristic of the last 200 years that the number of wars that an individual person might expect to see in their lifetime has declined. Some of our wars have been really horrible, as you know, in the last century, but for the individual person is less likely to see someone attacked violently, killed violently, to see blood, to see someone dead because of either government action, executing someone for what we would consider silly crimes now. People were executed for stealing a horse, for stealing a bread, and so on 200 years ago. All of that, somehow we've gotten beyond that, and while the news media is filled with murders that occur and school shootings and in Chicago and Detroit, if we look historically, the rate is really, really fallen.
Oh, that's amazing. I never would have thought that, because what we're hearing on the news and what just transpired in Florida and and the murder rate in Chicago and things of that sort.
In the United States, there's a little blip starting in 2015, and we don't know if that'll be sustained. But compared to world history, it's a little blip. It's not anywhere near the number that someone 304, the number of violent deaths someone 300 or 400 years ago would have experienced in their lifetime. And these are lifetimes that only lasted an average of 30 years rather than 80 like we have.
That's true, too. I've got a question for you. Okay. What about the world per capita GDP? Has that improved? Are more people falling into areas whereby their purchasing power has increased?
This is the kind of the key to my argument about flourishing, because we have, in my view, increased our flourishing, the meaningfulness that we're able to have in our lives in the last 200 years, because per capita income has gone from no change for as far back as the economic historians can measure. Okay, I can show you the books. Okay, where for most of history, people lived on $3 a day.
Wow,
going all the way back.
$3 a day.
$3 a day. Okay, now you have to modify that because historically there was really bad income inequality, and it was an income inequality based on status that existed during most of that time. That is, there was a priest class, or there was an aristocratic class, or there was a warrior class that owned most of the land, and for all of that period, land was wealth. You got the more land you had, the wealthier you were, the more tenants that you could extract rents from. And so since most of the land in most places that we're aware of was owned by a small set of elites, sometimes as low as 10% of the population owning 80% of all of the wealth that existed in the society, and that was hereditary. Okay, until the next army came in and conquered, and then there was a new set that was hereditary. You would have to expect that the 80 or 90% of the population that weren't in that particular group were living on even less, okay, like $100 a day, where if you go to some parts of equatorial Africa, you find people living on $300 a year, which is about $1 a day. There are places in India where you can go and find people living on less than $1 a day, about $300 a year. Well, that's the way yours and my ancestor, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and grandmother, all the way back through whoever my progeny were back there, lived. They lived on that kind of an income. And that meant that they didn't bathe. They were filthy and stinky and disease-ridden. It meant that they lived in houses that were basically four walls and some sort of vegetation for a roof. Almost nobody would have had a floor, like made out of planking or stone or something like that. It would have been ground.
Real ground.
Yes, and that means that you would have been swamped, just simply inundated with vermin and mice and rats and all kinds of other things. The animals that you're raising in order to stay alive are oftentimes in your house or certainly around your house. And so the mud you're tromping through is not like the mud you and I tromp through on those occasions when we have to. I mean, this is filthy stuff, and it's full of disease. And probably one of the reasons that people died is this is in their water. This gets into their food supply. They're being bitten by the rats and the mice that carry disease, and the fleas and the ticks and the bed bugs and the lice. There's a story of the Duke of Wellington. This is about 150 years ago. One of the rich people in England pulling his bed mattress back and seeing just a swarm of bed bugs under there. Okay, that you and I just don't have experience with anymore because we have ways of dealing with all of that. We live exceptionally clean. Okay, and that's why people live to be 30. That's why, if you live to be 40, your teeth fell out. Most people past 40 had no teeth. There were no dentists. There was no oral hygiene. There was no nutrition. It was not understood at all. And so it was a horrible thing. 200 years ago, that changed. Okay. And average incomes began slowly, okay, gradually. If you take a chart and put 1800 and take it to now, you see a gradual exponential curve. Now, I think you know what that means, but it's kind of flat initially, getting steeper and steeper until it's really steep. But if you look at one showing world history 10,000 years ago right up to now, this change looks like an absolute hockey stick, which is what they call it, okay? It's the hockey stick diagram when average incomes for everybody begin to rise. And they've continued to rise for the past 200 years, and the net result is that you get to have a bath every day, you get to have a floor in your house, you don't have all kinds of vermin and stuff crawling around in your house. You get to drive around in a car rather than ride around in a horse-drawn vehicle if you could have afforded it, and most couldn't. You get to have a cell phone. You get to just the range of things. You get to eat on 6% of your income, whereas if you live in poor areas of India, you pay upwards of 60% of your income for food. Okay,
that's interesting.
So something happened, and I say that something was the invention of the modern world, primarily free market system that allowed people to be innovative for the first time in history, not inventive, innovative. That is, you find something that makes life better, and you're able to modify it and modify it and modify it, and you're not stopped from modifying it, so that you eventually get something that makes our life more flourishing, if you will, to use the word.
There you go. There's the flourishing. In other words, you're happier.
You have to be kind of careful because I'm talking about an increase in our material well-being.
Okay.
And the pushback against that is, consumerism and materialism and isn't necessarily making us more flourishing people. My claim is that it does. That when your kids live, when they don't die before they're 5 years old, when they get to live and you get to watch them go to school and be educated, when you get to live to be 80 and see the world pass you by, and you don't experience famines, and you don't experience mass pestilences that kill off people all of the time, and you don't have some invading army come through and cause all of the kind of havoc the horrible havoc that those kind of armies did. And my ancestor could expect to experience that, okay? And I don't have any expectation of experiencing that. That's a better world to live in. That's a more flourishing world to live in. I get to make my living reading books and thinking about the world and only having to work 8 hours a day and being able to listen to the greatest music that the world has ever seen from any age that I want to. My ancestor couldn't do that. I can travel anywhere in the world relatively inexpensively. My ancestor had no chance. My ancestor usually didn't go more than 5 miles from their home in their whole life. Okay, I get to read the greatest books that have ever been written in all cultures and try and experience what they've had. And I can see on my television, even if I can't go there, what it's like to be in London or what it's like to be in Bangkok. Okay. I think that's a flourishing existence, and sure, it's a lot of material that I'm doing here, okay, and maybe there's some silly things that people make for us that we can buy, and so on, but I think the material well-being is clearly associated in most people's minds, okay, in the way that they live, with a more flourishing life, a more meaningful, happy life. That would be the thesis that I would take.
Let me ask you a question then. in 1949, Mao Zedong comes into China, and he implements the Communistic Party, kicks out the former regime. They head out to Taiwan. So if we look at it from a political ideology standpoint, and all the great things that you just brought up, how wonderful life is, my understanding is that through a series of controls that Mao instituted in that country, that these people did not have anything flourishing since 1949. Now, I just want you to grab onto this. Now, Mao Zedong's no longer in power, and we have a new leader, and the bamboo curtain has come up, and all these Western ideals are going into China, and we're seeing a middle class being formed. Is this part of flourishing, and does the government really play that much of an influence, whether or not a population flourishes or not?
Yeah. A government can really make things go bad if they want, if they make the decision to. At the same time that this free market system that I'm describing was getting underway, there was a reaction against it, okay, primarily by what we now call the Romantic movement, okay, who did think that the rise in material prosperity, the gradual rise in material prosperity, was not to be praised. It was getting people to live in congested in cities. They saw, and in the early part of this, that indeed was part of what was going on. And they tended to think that something human was being lost in the way that the free market system and at that point the early industrial revolution was unpacking, and they thought that something better could come along. Their main criticism was this materialistic criticism, but they also believed that all the free market was doing was establishing a new class system, that we'd replace the master-serf medieval system with an equally bad owner-worker system in which workers were being exploited. That is, the workers produced the value, they said, and the owners, because they owned the property, simply took most of it, but by the fact that they owned the property. So the workers are producing huge amounts of value and having it taken from them by the legal political system and given legal stealing, in other words, to the owner class. The capitalists is the way Karl Marx addressed it. That's where the word capitalism comes from. This is the system that's good for the owners of things.
Just a minute. You just said that Karl Marx actually was the first one to define capitalism?
Yeah, he's the one that invented the name.
That's amazing. All right.
Okay.
I got my shock for the day.
Here's another one for you. Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto is the first person to describe this rising prosperity that I'm talking about. Now, this is in 1848. It was just barely getting 50 years old. He's the first one to notice and describe it, and he describes it wonderfully. It's in that book. But at any rate, the idea then was that the free market system was an evil system, an unjust system, and it required the intervention of a benign, well-meaning government to establish a more just system in which the value that was being created by the workers went to the workers, a workers-oriented state. And that's the origin of what you're talking about, which is Marxist vision of socialism. There's a whole bunch of visions of socialism, but that's the one that got put into play in Russia starting in 1917, but especially when Stalin did his collectivizations starting in 1927. And then Mao came to China and started it. Now, when Mao came to China, let's remember things were not flourishing. nicely there. They'd had 100 years of horrible dislocations, a war in the 1850s, a kind of rebellion that had killed upward of 20 million people. Then the Japanese came, and many, 20 million, something like that, Chinese may have died at the hands of the Japanese and in the starvation and all of that happened then. And the government that they pushed out, the Republican or nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, was not a benign government in the Western sense. It was extremely corrupt and not doing much for the people. And if you just looked at it at the point, good riddance is the way that most people would have characterized it. But Mao made things really, really bad. Okay, he attempted collectivization right away when they got there. That is common property. Common property has two big problems that the socialists have never been able to escape. Okay, it invariably, when things are common, especially when you're not dealing with people who are loved ones in a family. Okay, sometimes a common system can work when people have deep love and respect for one another, but that's always a really small group that can be involved in something like that. And even those, okay, some of the utopian experiments that were run in early America that were done by people absolutely committed to this common system ended up not working. And the two problems that always arise are number one, the incentive problem. There seems to be something in human nature, if there, Dr. Smith-Larman would cringe at that idea that there's some, but it just seems to happen. You can't seem to socialize out of people. The idea that if I work hard and create goods and services that I need them for my family, and you say, no, it's going to be for the good of the whole, that I don't get some resentment, and that resentment builds into a willingness to kind of semi-go on strike against the system. It's the economists call this the incentive, okay? If the incentives aren't right, people don't work as hard, and you end up getting less stuff. And so you don't get an economy that creates increasing amounts of goods and services, and you clearly don't get one that is innovative when you use a common property system, at least so far. The experiments that we've run, and we've run a lot, they've been disasters, and that hasn't happened. And the second one is the social scientists call it moral hazard. Moral hazard means that people take more than and more. And if you put out something and say, okay, we're going to distribute this so that everybody has some, the incentive is to take more than your share, to get more, to behave in such a way that you increase the risk to society rather than decrease the risk to society, because there's this guarantee that if your behavior goes bad, then Big Brother, the government, or whoever's running things will step in and make it right. So people, there's a place in Texas that's been flooded by, when the hurricanes come through, that's been flooded badly 5 times in the last 50 years, and each time federal government has come back in and rebuilt their houses. So what do? They build their houses in the floodplain because they're, and a similar kind of thing. We don't have time to do this now. You can do this another time if you want. But in 2008, a system was set up in which banks were making really horrible mortgages, okay? And those horrible mortgages were all being collated at Fannie and Freddie and then farmed out, sold out as a kind of financial instrument. I don't know if you wouldn't call it a bond and you wouldn't call it a stock or whatever. Fannie and Freddie had 50% of those. Okay.
And that was the bundled housing? Is that what?
Yeah, that's where they bundled all the mortgages together.
Gotcha.
Okay. some bad, some good. And the idea is some physicists had worked it out that the good ones would take care, would generate enough revenue to cover the bad ones if they went under. But all the bad ones were in balloon loans. And when the price of housing started going up so that you couldn't refinance your house at a lower interest rate, when the price of housing started to decline in 2006, then these things started to go under. The people who had gotten mortgages they couldn't afford or were just paying, their payment was going on the interest and nothing to the principal, and gradually that rose up through these mortgage securities so that they were becoming worthless. And once they became worthless, okay, even though there were houses in them, at that point nobody would buy them. Then the rules said that the company had to declare that as valueless. And so Lehman Brothers overnight was bankrupt, okay? And when Bear Stearns went under 4 months before that, we bailed them out when that happened. When Lehman came, we didn't. And that sent the idea that, hey, government's not going to bail all of these out, and they all started collapsing. And then, as you know, we all had, President Bush and Nancy Pelosi bailed them out. President Obama kept bailing them out. And the net result is there's some evidence that the banks are still doing this.
They're still hanging on to the money. Ben Bernanke was making a decision. He said the idea was to let Lehman Brothers go down, and that'll serve as a lesson for all those other people in the same business.
Right. Yeah.
It didn't work.
It didn't work.
No.
Well, that was a moral hazard, and socialism has that problem. Plus, the socialists are idealists. They think they can create social systems in their heads, and you can make them and apply them to a society and make the society work better, okay? Even though you've never experimented with it, you've never tried it. So in 1958, Mao tried something called the Great Leap Forward, and the idea was that he was going to industrialize. Stalin had done this by mass murdering 10 million Ukrainian peasants, starving them to death, stealing all their food, trading it into Germany for industrial might, and that's where the beginning of Soviet industry came. And then putting it together with slave labor of the rest of the people in Russia who were in the Soviet Union who weren't lucky enough not to be in the Ukraine and have died, okay? When they finally opened up the gulags, it's estimated 50% of the population was in gulags.
Wow.
Okay? And so Mao tried, he was going to industrialize, but he was going to do it in a decentralized way, not a centralized way. And so they sent out the cadres to have all of the peasants build little ovens in their backyard and melt down their farming implements and then create industrial steel production. They would produce their own steel, and this would be kind of the way that they did it. Well, then in 1959, nobody had farming instruments, and you couldn't plant, and it caused a famine that killed, the estimate is 30 million people starved to death in the next 2 years. And now, after this, the rational people, Deng Xiaoping and some others, kind of forced Mao to the background. Mao wasn't done. He came back in when was it, 1968 is what I'm thinking. I can't remember the dates of the Cultural Revolution. It was 10 years. 68 to, that's not right. 62 to,
in the 60s.
62 to 72 sounds right. And so at this point, you just took all of the high school and college students and give them a little red book and tell them they're in charge, and go find your elders and make sure they're towing the line. And if they're not, we're sending them out. We're going to put dunce caps on them and send them out into the countryside. And you lost a whole generation of really talented Japanese people, Chinese people who were just in limbo for 10 years. Yeah. So all of that was really bad. Then Mao died.
Yes.
And in 1974, 76, and Deng Xiaoping eventually emerged, this guy who had By the way, in the Cultural Revolution, he was demoted and sent to the countryside to work in a truck factory. And while he was working in the truck factory, he realized how badly the Chinese system was working. And so when he got there, he said, we're going to go out and see how the rest of the world is taking care of people. And suddenly these Chinese communists who'd been wandering around in the back country for 30 years went to the United States, and they went to Japan, and they went to Europe, and they saw wealth that was unimaginable to them, and they said, we want this. And so gradually, first in agriculture, and then in special economic zones built around certain coastal cities, they simply said, okay, if you can make a profit and you'll get to keep it, okay? We're not going to have rules and regulations that suppress anybody from starting a business if they want to. You don't have to go ask permission. You don't have to get 500 forms filled out. Just start one. There was some guy who was running around begging for food who figured out that he could sell sunflower seeds that are baked or fried in some way that the Chinese really like. And 5 years later, he's a millionaire, which is nobody was a millionaire in Mao's China. And the net result was that their average incomes started to rise in the 1980s, okay? And they reached the threshold where that curve turned from flat to steep, okay, fairly quickly, way quicker than the United States and Great Britain, especially Great Britain did, so that in the last 15 years, 1 billion people, most of them in China, some of them in India, have gone from absolute destitute poverty of the kind I was describing 200 years ago of my ancestor into a middle-class existence. That is a house, running water, running hot water, garbage on the street that the truck comes and picks up, car in the garage, wealth in the last 15 years. It's the greatest decrease in inequality the world has ever seen. It's happened in the last 15 years, okay? World inequality is going down right now.
Wow. So. Let me ask you a question about China since we're still on that before we move on. When Ping took over, he implemented a one child per family policy. And that's just been lifted. But what, in your estimate, did that have, I mean, obviously we had wonderful things going on here, but the male to carry on the family name was so important. Did that have any kind of an effect on the economics, or they were trying to control the population? I think they broke the code from an economic standpoint. We can put together this wonderful strategy, but we have to be able to control our population.
Yeah.
What's your feeling on that?
That's more in your field, Bob, in the sociology aspect of it. And I just know marginal stuff about it. I've heard that there are 57 men to about 57% men to about 43% females. But I read recently that it may not be as bad as that. We do know that there were some families who aborted or exposed female children because they thought that they needed a male in order to deal with things. This is what I can tell you. When you get economic growth, the fertility rate declines. There's almost like a one-to-one correlation with economic growth and the fertility rate. And part of the reason is if you live at a subsistence level, when you get old, you're going to need somebody to take care of you. Therefore, you need to have lots of kids so that since only 4 out of 10 are going to survive, there's somebody left who can bring you into their home when you get old, okay? So the older societies tended to have very high fertility rates. When you get rich, then you can have things like a 401k and so on, so that now when people reach those kinds of ages, they're normally able to take care of themselves. In fact, they're usually quite well off because they have a huge amount of equity in a house. Normally, not everybody, but they do. And There are usually social programs in advanced countries to take care of them, and so there's not this this driving impetus to have the next child. Another thing, Mom isn't at home anymore,
No.
and Mom kind of likes not washing, taking all day Monday to wash the clothes down, wading in the river, and dealing with it that way, and modern science comes along and figures out how all this works, and so the birth control methods get really, really a lot better, and so wealthy countries, just all of them. In fact, some of them are having real problems with the birth dearth. Okay, that is, their populations are not replacing themselves. In Russia, in Greece, in some Eastern European countries, it's as low as 1.2 children per family. And but don't worry, we're in Utah, where we're still just a little bit above replacement. And the United States has been fairly lucky in recent years in that we've had a lot of immigration, that because you do need young people in a community, in a nation, to keep the infrastructure and the factories and the businesses and the food growing and all of that. And we've been able to do that primarily through immigration, and that so that we don't have some of those same kind of problems that they're having in some of the European countries.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I've only gotten through about one half of the questions that I have for you. So can I impose upon you and ask, would you be available to come back for our next show? And
Oh, of course, Bob. I
appreciate that.
I'm happy to come back and talk to you anytime.
You just are loaded with information, and I had a list of questions that I wanted to talk to you, and we really didn't get into your position and we've got some idea as to why capitalism, your position is superior to socialism. But I want to give you more of an opportunity. There's some other questions I want to dig into, and if you would agree to this, that would be wonderful. And I'd like to call this our part one of capitalism, superior to socialism, and then have Professor Joe Green come back and join us next week. Are you available, sir?
I am. Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Professor Joe Green, and the topic was looking at government ideologies, and specifically capitalism versus socialism. And Professor Green has adopted the position that capitalism is indeed superior to socialism. So stay tuned. We're going to bring Professor Green back next week, and we're going to continue on in part two of this, taking a look at capitalism versus socialism. And in the meantime, please have a safe and enjoyable week. And don't forget that we air this program, we rebroadcast on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. on KDXI 100. So have a good day, everyone. And this has been Tips, Topics, Issues, and Positions. Thank you very much.